Now, interesting developments in the last 24 hours or so, with news reports flooding in on who will make it to Team Biden. And it seems like Biden's government and Biden's team will be a truly A-team, an eclectic mix of old-timers from the Obama administration and those who have already really made their mark in foreign policy in various ways. Let's take a look at who could make it to the final cut.
President-elect Joe Biden began naming members of his cabinet with a view to mend the United States' relations with various countries and reflect the country's diversity. Here's a look at the key picks so far and top contenders in fray for Biden-Harris's A-team. Biden may tap his long-term confidant Antony Blinken as Secretary of State, one of the most crucial portfolios. This could be good news for India, as Blinken sees China as a common challenge for India and the US and has been keen on working closely with New Delhi in the past. Biden has said he's also chosen a Treasury Secretary whose name will be unveiled on Thursday. Former Fed Chair Janet Yellen is the front-runner. Wall Street reacted positively as she earlier supported continuing fiscal support and will also work well with the central bank. Michelle Flournoy is consensus frontrunner for Defense Secretary, making her the first woman to lead the Pentagon. If chosen, she will join Blinken in the 2+2 ministerial dialogue that happens between India and the US, with the Indian side represented by the Minister for External Affairs and the Defense Minister. While Jake Sullivan is a national security advisor, Homeland Security is expected to be headed by Alejandro Mayorkas, making him the first Latino and the first immigrant to lead this portfolio. The Indian Americans in the fray include Arun Majumdar for Energy, Indra Nooyi for Commerce, and Vivek Murthy for Health and Human Sciences. While some Democrats have been critical of India's policies on the citizenship bill and Kashmir in the past, Biden is unlikely to be overly intrusive as he's keen to have robust ties with India. Modi and Biden, in fact, also spoke recently where they reaffirmed their commitment to US-India ties and discussed shared priorities. Chandra R. Shrikant, ET Now, Bengaluru.
So imagine Indra Nooyi hammering out a trade deal with India on the other side. So we don't know, we're waiting for the final names, but exciting times. What is the overall sort of theme that is emerging and what does it mean for India? To speak on this, I'm joined now by Meera Shankar, former ambassador to the United States, Akshay Mathur, director at ORF, and Michael Kugelman, deputy director at the Asia program and senior associate at the Wilson Center. Welcome to all of you and thank you for speaking with us on the show today. Michael, let me begin with your take on what's the excitement back in Washington and what's the buzz with the team? It seems like an exciting mix of people for sure.
Well, yes. I mean, clearly there's a lot of happiness that the GSA has finally signed off on the election, which allows the transition process to formally begin, and most importantly, for the money to start flowing into the transition team to support their efforts. I think that with these names that have come out so far, these nominees that we know to this point, Jake Sullivan, Antony Blinken, and presumably soon enough, Michelle Flournoy, Avril Haines, these are people that all know each other very well. They've all worked together before in the Obama administration, and they tend to see eye to eye. And again, I'm talking here about the nominees focused on foreign policy and national security. And I should say as well that they are all strong backers of U.S.-India partnership. But this, I think for me, this does raise some interesting questions. I mean, you have a great group of very talented, experienced leaders that are going to be working together, but they're all Democrats and they all served in the Obama administration. That suggests that perhaps we could see a progressive Democrat that could be appointed. That could mean that Elizabeth Warren could be in the mix. So Biden will want to try to bring this country together by putting a lot of different folks under the same tent. So I imagine we could see a more progressive Democrat being nominated for a cabinet post. And also, I think a big question is whether he would try to bring someone from the Republican Party into the cabinet or to have some type of senior position. Again, Biden has put a strong emphasis on the need to heal and bring the country together because of the deep divides that we've had over the last 4 years. So that suggests to me that while he wanted to get things over with initially with bringing back people that he knows, people that he's worked with, people that he trusts, he will also want to broaden the scope as well and have others that are not necessarily close to the Obama Democrats. One would want to cast a wider net. So I think that's something to watch out for in the coming weeks.
Interesting is the kind of mix, and Akshay, let me come to you on this. The representation of women, the representation of Indian Americans, of immigrants, and it seems to be like a message is being given out with this choice of team as well. Not just, of course, domestically within America, but to the world as well.
Yes, and like Michael was just saying, they have deep expertise. Let's remember that many of these appointees have worked under the Obama administration. Some of them back, have the experience starting with the Clinton administration. There's certainly a diversity of gender, diversity of views, but there's also, you spoke of Indira Nooyi and the possibility of her becoming the Secretary for Commerce. That wouldn't be the first time, though. Even under President Trump, if you remember, he had appointed Rex Tillerson as the Secretary of State, who was the CEO of ExxonMobil. So, and Hank Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary under the Bush administration, came from Goldman Sachs. So there is a precedent in the United States to bring in people from business. And it has not just happened in the democratic governments, but it has also happened in the Republican governments. I think for us, I want to say that we need, from India, we need to keep in mind two things. The kind of scope that the United States diplomacy and diplomats have to deal with. It's not just China. I know for India, China is really important, but there's so many things happening in the world. So the pressure and the scope of the United States is so huge. And also, what I would be watching out for in this team that you've just mentioned is the economic team. Who's going to be the Treasury Secretary? Who's going to be the Director of the National Economic Council in the White House? And who is going to lead the Federal Reserve? These three appointments are very important. I know that national security and the Secretary of State typically get a lot of attention, but remember, we are in a pandemic. The global economic recovery is really important for us. And the United States is still a very important economic superpower, and what it does with its economy and around the world matters to us. So let's see what kind of team they put in place for an economic recovery. I think that will be really important for us to watch.
Yeah, everyone's excited about the possibility of Janet Yellen making it to that team. Ambassador Shankar, I want to speak specifically about Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State and of course what it means for the 2+2 going forward, the choices of names over there. What are the things specifically that India now has to focus on to take this relationship forward?
Look, Anthony Blinken is a long-time foreign policy aide of President Biden, and he's been Deputy Secretary of State earlier. So he's a seasoned hand and one who knows the president's mind. So in that sense, he should also have the president's ear and would be quite key in shaping the policies that the Biden administration will follow to the world. He's addressed the Hudson Institute, if you remember, a couple of months back, where he's spoken extensively about China, about the relationship with India. And he's emphasized the importance of India in terms of being a partner in the Indo-Pacific, in terms of meeting the common challenge posed by China's assertiveness in this region. He's also talked of India's importance as a player in meeting global challenges, and that none of these global challenges would really be possible to deal with effectively if India is not on board. For instance, climate change, and he's talked of his role in, dealing with Prime Minister Modi and Biden's role in dealing with Prime Minister Modi during the Obama administration with regard to the Paris Accord. He's also talked of there being no tolerance at all for any kind of terrorism, cross-border or otherwise. Jake Sullivan has also been in the State Department with Hillary Clinton, I think also in her private staff, and then with Biden as National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden when Blinken moved to the Department of State. And he's considered an up-and-coming thinker, having been a Rhodes Scholar, and he's very young for the post of National Security Advisor. He's written extensively on the challenge posed by China, and I think he's argued for a middle way between containment and a grand bargain with China. He's talked of a policy of managed competition with China, whereby the outcomes also should be clear when they embark on this, that the outcomes cannot be, or the desired outcomes cannot and will not be as they were in the Cold War, the collapse of communism or the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is not likely given China's far more complex hold on power, as well as the challenge that it poses. But he's talked of desirable outcomes in terms of preserving the advantage for the US in economic, military, and political terms. So these are very seasoned hands, and they do know this area.
Yes, that's an interesting point, and I'd like to take that forward. Yes, if you'd allow me, I'd like to take that forward actually, and let me come to Akshay Mathur again for a comment on that, because the world is going to be watching how the Biden team and the Biden administration deals with China. Can they afford to seem like they're softening up? And where does India sort of come into the picture, even as America would like to continue that pressure on China, perhaps not in the Trump manner, but definitely the pressure will be there.
Yes, and for us, it'll be important to watch. Remember, under the Trump administration, one of the things that happened was that Trump administration put a lot of focus on the trade linkages, and the US-China trade war became its own phenomenon. But behind the scenes, what the Trump administration was also trying to do was also trying to curb the technology advancements that China had made. Really, actually, under the covers, it was a war on technology. As some of us who followed the Trump administration's linkages and engagements with Xi Jinping over the last 4 or 5 years. Where India comes in, I don't think India has seen a stronger response from the United States than it did under the Trump administration. Remember, under the Obama administration, they were trying to put the Trans-Pacific Partnership into place. And that was Obama's response to a rising China. And then Trump came and withdrew from that partnership amongst many other multilateral institutions. So one of the big differences was the Obama administration tried to create frameworks like the trade agreements to contain China, to compete with China, and make sure that some of the global economic trading arrangements are in the favor of the United States, Europe, and the democratic world. Whereas Trump administration took a more bilateral approach, and it was more vociferous, but it was certainly more vocal. For India, you have seen that our economic relations and security relations have suffered a little bit over the last couple of years. But for us, we need the time and the space and to grow our linkages with other parts of the world. I cannot underline enough for India, our capital and our FDI and foreign institutional investors that your reporter was just talking about on ET Now, all that comes from the West. It does not come from China. It does not come from ASEAN. Even if the money comes through Singapore or through Hong Kong, it's being routed through the West. So we need the West. And so it's in our favor for now, at least as far as the business is concerned, to seek capital from the West. So a stronger linkage with the United States is absolutely necessary.
Well, you know, Michael, one challenge, do you see this as a challenge going forward? Because the mandate for Biden is to undo a lot of things that Trump did. It's an anti-Trump mandate, if I may put it that way. And that can be a little tricky when it comes to things like relationships with China, when it comes to America First or Make in America or protecting American jobs. Do you think that's going to be a bit of a tricky terrain going forward?
Well, absolutely. It's a very overwhelming mandate. It's a very ambitious mandate, and there's a lot of expectations and a lot of pressure on his administration. And that, I would argue, applies even more to the home front. You know, we've been having this discussion on Biden's foreign policy, but there's a lot to undo at home. I would argue that the damage that the Trump years caused domestically may exceed those caused internationally. I mean, as you know, he botched the pandemic response. So we've got this public health challenge it's probably one of the worst the U.S. has had in a generation. There's an economic crisis that's emerged from the pandemic. And then also I would argue that there's a societal crisis too, rooted in the deep toxic divides wrought by the Trump administration and racial tensions as well. That's all going to take a lot of effort. And as I said earlier, one of his major focus areas will be on healing. So I would think that while he's a foreign policy president, he's probably the most qualified U.S. president on foreign policy in many years, perhaps since George H.W. Bush when he took office in 1988. But I do think the domestic front will be a key focus. But when he gets to the world, indeed, it's going to take time to repair what was lost. And while I think the ideal thing would just be to willy-nilly re-enter these global forums and these institutions that the Trump administration had pulled out of, the Paris Agreement, WTO, the Iran nuclear deal, but that will take some time for sure, and there's going to be a lot of delicate diplomacy that'll need to be done. Also, I think that there could be some countries, particularly rivals of the U.S., that find it arrogant and inappropriate for Biden to come in and just assume that he could, automatically have his administration reassert its leadership and become the world superpower and act as the global leader just like that. These types of things take time, and obviously the likes of China and Russia and other key U.S. rivals, they won't necessarily take to that. So it's going to be very difficult, but I will say that he's put the right team together. And I think that if there is ever a time when you would want to have experienced hands who know each other well and have worked together and know the president-elect very well, now is the time to have that, because I think the U.S. faces one of its biggest foreign policy and domestic policy challenges, one of the biggest twin challenges that it's had in many years. So it's a huge lift. Very heavy lift for President Biden, who, of course, we note is, I believe, the oldest president, or will be the oldest president. And I think that will put some pressure on Kamala Harris as well. I think that he will look to her to be much more involved in policy than is typical for a vice president. And it also raises the possibility that he could well be a one-term president if he concludes that his age doesn't allow him to move forward. So I think that we really need to think about Harris and what she could do. Finally, on a very quick note, one appointment we did not mention was John Kerry as the new presidential envoy for climate change, and he'll be housed in the National Security Council. It's a terrific idea. It reflects how the importance that Biden places on climate change, and also it reflects how something that has been known for quite some time, that climate change is a national security threat, it has national security implications in the U.S. and globally as well. So I think that's a really nice move by President-elect Biden right there.
Absolutely. John Kerry is an interesting name. Janet Yellen, if it goes through, is a very interesting name, and we should discuss that a little more. But Ambassador Shankar, I want to come to you with a different point. And I know we've spoken about it in the past, and it's sort of been brushed aside, but I think it merits a closer look. Is what we can expect from the Biden administration in terms of responses to some of India's domestic policies, as well as, you know, what happens here, be it Kashmir or be it issues around minorities. Can we expect some kind of not so friendly comments and voices coming in from the Biden administration? And do you think that the Indian government is bracing for it, preparing for it?
Well, I think that they would overall lay more emphasis on democracy, democratic freedoms, and human rights. And within that framework, the issues you've spoken about may also be touched upon. But my sense is that they would rather engage with India on these issues than, point fingers. And a lot will depend on how we play it as well, because, our own policy has scope for evolution in many areas. For instance, Jammu and Kashmir. I mean, we have a statement by our Home Minister that he's prepared to restore statehood should the situation improve. How nimble, how flexible can we be so that you can ease off these pressures? But I think it will always be within the overall framework of the larger strategic convergence. And you've had Jake Sullivan talk about it, and he said we have to find a balance between our interests and our values. So you probably see them speak to both, but I think less in a manner of finger pointing and perhaps more with a view to engage the Indian government on these issues. But let's look at the economic side. We don't have his, Biden's list of economic nominees, except for the speculation that Janet Yellen could be the Treasury Secretary. We don't know who the U.S. Commerce Secretary would be, or who the U.S. Trade Representative would be. Sure, Biden is going to face the same pressures with regard to Buy American, Hire American that President Trump faced, because it's the same constituencies hit by globalization who need to be responded to in terms of US domestic politics and can't be ignored. But at the same time, I would expect that there would be less outright protectionism than the Trump administration, and a greater willingness to negotiate rather than take unilateral action. With regard to other areas such as education and health, we could expect more cooperation, science and technology, renewable energy. We could expect more cooperation between India and the US.
I think the important point to remember is that even if it's a very different administration with very different political goals, when it comes to foreign policy, there may not be too much of a difference in what the stated common goals are for a Biden administration versus a Trump administration, and that's something that we have to keep in mind. For example, a trade deal and negotiations over a trade deal might hit some of the very same roadblocks. So it's an interesting space to watch, and I want to thank all of you for joining us and giving us perspective on these very exciting times.